Our fellow Aggies, visitors, and our Gibbs keynote speaker, Dr. Breines. It is my pleasure to bring greetings on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences and its Dean, Dr. Goldie Bird. This is the first Gibbs conference which celebrates the life and legacy of Dr. McCain, an A&T and national hero. A&T has stood for justice for over 100 years now, and I'm very glad to see this turn out to celebrate that legacy of A&T. I hope you enjoyed the speaker, and I hope you've enjoyed the conference. Without further ado, let me introduce Ms. Shybri Wilson, President of the History Scholars, who will make a statement on behalf of the students in the history department.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
My name is Shybri Wilson. I am a senior history major here at North Carolina A&T State University. I currently serve as the 2013-2014 History Scholars President. Tonight, we are honored to have guest keynote speaker Dr. Paul Breines, and he will deliver a speech on his experience as a freedom rider and also at the Parchman Prison in the Mississippi Delta. Thank you again.
Well, I'll say good evening to everyone again. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm going to talk very briefly about the occasion. This is the 26th annual Gibbs Lecture, and we are striving for more and more years. It's held in commemoration of Warren Thomas Gibbs' birthday and his life. He was the fourth president of A&T, and he was a historian, so for the historians in the house, yay. He wrote a book in 1966 called A History of North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College, which recorded the history of A&T since its land grant origins until President Dr. Lewis Dowdy's administration. He served as the head of the university during the 1960 Senate movement, and this annual lecture occurs every year on his birthday or around his birthday, which is on April 5th. I encourage you to look in your programs on page 6. There's a bio of his life there. Scholars with expertise in African American history and civil rights, people who knew Dr. Gibbs, have come and given these lectures in past years. Now, Dr. Gibbs lived to be 101 years old. It's a long life. But despite this long life, he is most known for having been the president during the A&T 4 sit-ins. And it was during that sit-in movement that he stood against the state officials, and he said that we teach our students how to think, not what to think. And in this vein of thinking, this conference is built around this. Today, all morning, we've had an afternoon, we've had our first annual conference. For those who are interested, I see some people who are in attendance this morning and this afternoon. I encourage you to submit papers for next year's student conference. And this is all about encouraging students to think for themselves, think outside of the box, and grow as scholars. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Nana Koku, a junior criminal justice major with a minor in African American history, and I'm here on behalf of the History Scholars to welcome everyone. I serve as the 2013-2014 Vice President of the History Scholars. Okay, are there any faculty and staff in the building? If so, could you please stand up? Can we give them all a hand clap? Are there any middle college students here today? Could you please stand up? If so. Okay. Are there any A&T students here in the audience?
today. If so, could you please stand up? Are there any members that represent the community here today? Can we get that? Once again, from the history scholars, we would like to thank everyone for coming out. Next, we will have Dr. Michael Roberto, Associate Professor here at North Carolina A&T, who will introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me tonight to introduce the speaker, Dr. Paul Breines. I have known Paul Breines since 1976. Dr. Breines at Boston College was a distinguished teacher and a very fine scholar who wrote 2 books, both of which are mentioned here in the program. In the many years that Dr. Breines taught at BC, he embodied the true intellectual who not only studied history, analyzed history, wrote history, but taught history in a way in which the material that he taught came alive to us as his students. A very extraordinary fellow. The best testament that anyone could say is that when he or she retires from a university after many years, people come out in a multitude to attend his retirement, which is basically what happened. This has been a great conference. Many of the things that have been said, I think, will resonate among us, students, faculty, people in the community, and I know that I speak for all of my colleagues when we say that we're so pleased that this has happened. For me, in introducing Dr. Breines, and I will close with this introduction, is that Dr. King, in 1967, said that we in America needed a revolution of values, that there was a world revolution occurring, and that America, at that point, was on the wrong side of the revolution. Those of us who experienced the terror of the counter-revolution in this country, like the young Paul Breines, who went to the South as a freedom rider and experienced the brutality here and lived to tell about it, and then came back and taught it and lived it and passed it on to people like me, proves one thing, that the revolution is very much alive, and it's alive in all of us. And with that, I introduce my friend, my mentor, my loving brother, Paul Breines.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. I can't live up to the wonderful words that Michael said on my behalf. There's no way I can do it. I hope I don't disappoint you, but I'm sorry, Michael, I'm not that good. But I appreciate that enormously, and it's inspiring. And I thank Michael very much because Michael made this happen for me. That is, you I think, encouraged Professor Ndege that I might be a worthwhile participant in the Gibbs lectures and in this conference, and you fell for it, and were kind enough to invite me to come. And I thank you and Carolyn Ruff and all the faculty in the history department. Professor Smallwood is here, and to those of you in the history scholars. I'm starting to cry because, don't worry, this is good. It's good for me. Because I've never been to Greensboro before. This is my first visit. But I have to say, it's a homecoming. I interrupted myself. I'm here in the presence of the mayor, and this is quite an honor. I've never been here before, but being here, in a lot of ways, for me, is a kind of homecoming. because the thing that links in my mind 1961 and the Freedom Rides, in which I was one of 350 to 450 participants, my role was quite small. But between 1961 and 2014, I find myself still asking the question that I've been asking since I was 7 or 8 years old, and I'll tell you why I started thinking about it at that young age, and that is becoming aware that I'm a white person. And I began to wonder, what kind of a white person do I want to be? What kind of a white person can I be? And I think I began to develop an answer to that question because of Franklin McCain and Ezell Blair and David Richmond and Joseph McNeil. In this sense, it's a homecoming because what they did in 1961, you hear a lot about the impact that they had. And I was one of the people that they had an impact on. So that is, when they did what they did, I realized that's where I have to be. That's what I have to be with them, somehow, what they're doing. And I was everyone who participated in the Freedom Rides, white or black, was inspired by these 4 young men and what they did. That is the simple act of sitting down at the lunch counter. So coming here is kind of a homecoming. I feel it's a return to a place which spiritually and in certain ways politically gave me a chance to begin to reflect on that question, what kind of a white person do I want to be, which calls not just for reflection, but it calls for doing something about being a white person. And I find in 2014 that I'm still asking that question. And I still don't know how to talk to all the other, and I don't mean every other white person, and this is something, I'll come back to this, but to talk to other white people and ask them, when are you going to wake up? When can't you think into your hearts about what you're doing when you're doing racism? Do you have to do it? I don't know how to talk yet to enough white people. It's a great honor being among you. And among most of you who I'm now among are black people, are African Americans, are what back in the day of the Freedom Rides were called Negroes. And I've been wondering for a very long time, and I still am. I don't know if this is the revolution that Michael is talking about that's still alive, but that question remains alive for me, and I will, for the rest of my life, and to my life so far, am indebted to the 4 A&T students who did what they did, and for me, they opened a window on where into which I could move, or a window I could jump out of, and begin to deal in more depth with the question of what kind of white person I want to be. Let me quickly clarify one thing and pare my role in this picture down to the size that I think it warrants. Professor Ndege, in her introduction, mentioned that I was one of the original Freedom Riders. That's partly true, and I don't mean to, but you'll see what the difference is. The video that the A&T student has done, and you see the pictures of the buses being attacked and being burned. And one of the, here's another person, and in the case of Jim Zwerg, who's in the top picture, he's a white person. Here he is in the bottom picture as an adult. So he survived this beating. The original Freedom Riders, that is the small group that was on these buses that were attacked in Birmingham and Anniston and burned and firebombed, and everyone in them was beaten. John Lewis was in that group. And I noticed that Matthew Walker was up in one of the pictures. Those were the original Freedom Riders. Jim Zwerg was one of them. That is, for those of us who were Freedom Riders, the original Freedom Riders was the small group of us who were on the first buses. And those were my heroes. That is, here is Jim Zwerg, beaten to a pulp by a white mob that attacked the Freedom Ride buses in Anniston. 2.5 months later, he was giving a fundraising talk for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and for the Congress of Racial Equality to raise funds for the Freedom Rides. He had his arm in a sling and bandages all on his head, and you see over his right eye where he was wounded there. I mean, he's obviously beaten pretty badly. And he gave a fundraising talk, and at the end of the fundraising talk, he said, we need more volunteers to join the Freedom Rides, to be ready to go to jail for an indeterminate period of time, and to commit themselves to nonviolent action. He said this, and he was talking to a group of mostly adults. I was there with my then girlfriend, and we were probably the two youngest people present because we didn't have much money to give to anything, so people had to be a little older. I was 20 years old at the time. And Jim Zwerg, as soon as Jim Zwerg said that, I realized, oh, there's another white guy and he's doing what I want to do. That's what we white people ought to be doing. We ought to be there. I want to be with him. And people have often asked, and everyone who participated in the Freedom Rides, and the Freedom Rides did involve this, I didn't know I wasn't going to be beaten to a pulp. So one of the things I will disappoint you with is to say that unlike John Lewis and Jim Zwerg and others in the first Freedom Rides, I don't have physical scars. I was hit in the lower back by a policeman's billy club when I was pushed into a police wagon when I was arrested in the Jackson, Mississippi bus station. But I'll tell you why I wasn't beaten to a pulp. It wasn't because I had a nice sport jacket on. It was because of what was happening with the Freedom Rides at that time. So I was not, technically speaking, an original Freedom Rider. I was one of those who joined in, and there were about 300 of us who, between June of 1961, when Diane Nash and the others in SNCC decided, against the wishes of James Farmer in CORE and others in the civil rights movement, to keep the Freedom Rides going. And what that meant was to continue to put a burden on the state of Mississippi by filling the jails with Freedom Riders and making it a very expensive proposition for the state of Mississippi. So I was one of a larger number of people who joined the Freedom Rides, and I can tell you briefly how it happened. Zwerg spoke, and something clicked in my mind, my head, and I decided that's what I have to do. I'm going to do this. And all of us who participate in the Freedom Ride are often asked, almost regularly asked the question, why did you do it? And in particular, people have been very forthright. Why would a white guy or other white women, why would you risk your lives, to support the rights of black people, of Negroes? Why would you do that? And each of us, and now I'm saying the us, and I'm leaving out, obviously, the large number of black Freedom Riders. I want to talk a little bit about white Freedom Riders, and I can't talk for all white Freedom Riders. I can only talk for myself, obviously. But the question, it was seeing Zwerg and saying, he is doing what I want to do. So he, like the A&T 4, and all of the other original Freedom Riders, those were my heroes, those were my inspiration, and they were the heroes and inspiration, and in this case, I think I can speak for all of us, the heroes of all of the Freedom Riders. So this is a kind of most people don't pay attention to this, but I'm sensitive to it because it's almost one of these things where I think, look, I don't have scars, so I don't qualify. That kind of, it's a little bit of that feeling, which is kind of stupid, but it seems real to me. Because what they did was so astonishing. Weren't you afraid to lose your life? Weren't you afraid to you would be killed? When Franklin McCain was asked that question, do you remember what he said? It's in print. He said, I was too scared. I was too angry, sorry. I was too angry to be scared. It's an interesting concept. I was too angry to be scared. Now, when I read that a couple of weeks ago, it was in the obituary article in the New York Times for Franklin McCain, where that quotation appears. And I thought, yes, I know exactly what he meant. That is, when I saw the pictures in the New York Times of the buses burning, I felt rage. I felt rage at that, and I felt rage, the rage that I had felt at earlier points in my life, and I say this for the purpose of raising something that maybe is worth discussing, and you may want to know more what I mean, and I'm not sure if I can tell you, but when I saw those buses, I had the feeling that I hate white people. And I am embarrassed and ashamed to be one of them. And that shocked me. Because I, in certain ways, didn't, that was, so when I read what Franklin McCain felt, I said, yeah, I felt that too. I felt rage. But there was more to it. And it's something else that I think my feeling of debt to Franklin McCain and Ezel Blair, who's now, as you know, Jabril Kazan, and David Richmond and Joseph McNeil, people have asked, they ask all the Freedom Riders a different version of the same question. Where did you get the courage to do that? Where did that courage come from? Now, I'm not, for better or worse, I'm not a practicing religious person of any faith. But I want to tell you of a brief experience, because it involves the A&T 4, of what I experienced, how a non-religious person can experience amazing grace. And it was this way. I realized in response to people asking that question, where did you get the courage? It was given to me. It was a gift. From the A&T 4, from Jim Zwerg, from the original Freedom Riders, from Rosa Parks, from the people in the Montgomery bus boycott, and from other people who I'll mention. But the gift, there was a gift. It was an amazing grace. It was as if the A&T 4 or Jim Zwerg had said, here's courage. We're giving it to you. You don't have to do anything. You've been chosen. Take it and do what you need to do. You don't have to get it. You don't have to buy it. You don't have to think about it. And I didn't. When I look back, I didn't think that I was going, I mean, a lot of 20-year-olds don't think they're going to be killed, but I knew that Zwerg was almost killed. I knew that people were going to be killed, and it didn't bother me. I don't know why, and the only answer I can give to that question is that somebody gave me a gift, and gave all of us who participated in the early civil rights movement that gift of courage. Now, parenthetically, obviously I didn't prepare a speech, but I'm telling you things that are coming sort of from my heart right now. Think of people of courage. I was in jail in Parchman Penitentiary along with hundreds of others for a little over a month in the summer of 1961. And when I was released from prison toward the end of August 1961, which means I went in late July. That's very late. I have to be very modest about this. I was not one of, even after the original Freedom Riders, I was not one of the first ones to go. All those folks have my immense admiration. But when we were released from prison, and parenthetically, I mentioned before that one of the things about the Freedom Ride as a tactic was to burden the state of Mississippi financially by filling the jails with people who would have to be supported in prison. It turned out that filling the prisons meant that there were quite a growing number of people who, because they wanted to get out of prison, would get out of prison, but it meant paying bail. And so this was an enormous burden, it turned out, on the civil rights movement, on the Congress of Racial Equality, and on SNCC. So some of us were asked if we would leave prison on the basis of pleading no contest, neither guilty nor innocent. Of what? We were put in jail for the crime of breach of peace, which we knew, that is, we went there to break the peace of Jim Crow, because it clearly was not peace. It was a form of war that we were trying to end by declaring a nonviolent war against it. I'm going to move from the sublime to the ridiculous now. I was released from prison with 5 or 6 other Freedom Riders. We pleaded no contest, which meant that I had a charge against me that would be on my record until it was removed, which it was later because nobody cared, by 40 years later. But I immediately ran to the Coke machine and the candy machine, because I had not seen them in 5 weeks. In prison, you don't have access to Coca-Cola or Snickers bars. So we went to the candy machine and the Coke machine. We drank ourselves and ate ourselves literally sick. We all 4 or 5 left the Hinds County Courthouse soda machine. We went outside and we threw up, all of us. And then someone said, don't worry, we're going afterwards to the fraternal lodge outside of Jackson, a black fraternal lodge, and some of the women are going to make you fantastic dinner, so your stomachs will feel better. So we go to this lodge, and we come in, and there's a group of older black men sitting on rocking chairs as we come in, and next to them, lined up on the wall, are 5 or 6 shotguns. And I had never seen a gun up close. That's how naive and sheltered a life I had had until then. 1961, I was born in 1941. I was 20 years old at that time. And so we, being young, brash types, said, oh, what's the story with these guns? We thought there was a nonviolent movement. And one of the men said, well, the movement is nonviolent, and we are not violent men. But the crackers come around here with their guns every once in a while, and I'll tell you something. They want to kill you, and they want to kill us, and they want to kill those women who are making you supper. And I thought, Jesus, forgive me, Christ, they are risking their lives to make us a dinner. And I don't even know what their names are. And they're not in any of the books. And there couldn't have been Freedom Rides without them. It wouldn't have worked. It took just ordinary folk like that. This is why if I can, I don't know how to do it as a white person. If I could speak for them, what they did is so amazing to me and so inspiring and so humbling. It was just, can you imagine that they did that? I mean, they're just making a meal. No, of course, it worked. My stomach felt fantastic. I didn't know what collard greens were, and that was my first brush with that. So it was quite wonderful. That was. I was born in 1941. That is during the Second World War. Oh, I forgot. Those of you who are history students, and some of you who, if this would be an interesting project, because I mentioned, he said, this is why we have the shotguns. I didn't finish that story, because when they come around and shoot up the place, and he took me outside the building, he said, look, And there were bullet holes all over the wall of this lodge, the wooden boards. And he said, this is what they're doing. And he said, we have the guns because when those crackers come around and shoot the place up, we fire our guns off in the air and it chases them away because they're cowards. That's what we do. But one of the things that's a new current in research on the civil rights movement is the way in which black armed self-defense in a small, local, and modest scale worked in tandem with a nonviolent activist movement. You say, oh, look, there's guns, that's bad, and there's nonviolent activists, that's good. And a lot of new research is suggesting, as that guy who was talking to me suggested, we're not violent, we're not out to kill anybody, but if people come to hurt us, we need to defend ourselves and at least fire off shots into the air. And it will chase these people away. And the research, some of the stuff, the new research that's being done is looking at the way in which nonviolent and armed self-defense aspects of the civil rights movement worked in tandem. My mother, as many women did during the Second World War, worked as a nurse in Army hospitals. And in the Second World War, Army hospitals and wounded veterans were not isolated from the rest of society. If someone came back from the European campaigns and was badly wounded and was hospitalized, they would be put in a local hospital. And so everyone got to see them. And they would come out of the building with a leg shot off or something like this, and you would say, oh, look, the integration between Army and civilian life at that time was very different, as those of you who are roughly my age will remember. But I mention this because my father was too old for combat service. So there would be times on particular weekends when my parents my father was off in Puerto Rico teaching Army troops how to make pontoon bridges, and my mother was working in the hospital. So what to do with little Paul? So, although we didn't have much money as a family, we lived in a one-bedroom apartment, they hired a woman, Mrs. Mary Van Hook, a black woman who was born in Jamaica and lived in Brooklyn, and I grew up with a nanny. So what I'm about to tell you is a little bit of the dynamics, or what Mike, my dear friend Mike, would call the dialectics of white skin privilege. And here's what it looked like, at least for me. Mrs. Mary Van Hook took care of me when I fell down and cut my knee, and she held me, and she kissed me, and she put a Band-Aid on me. And so for me, I had the experience with Mary Van Hook of the experience of black skin as a comfort. It's a precious experience. It may make some of you irritated, but for me, it's a precious experience. When I was 8, my parents found a farm in the Catskill Mountains in New York State that let rooms out to people who wanted to spend a week out of the city, come to the farm, see chickens running around, and have fresh eggs, and there were cows and fresh milk, and you rented a room. It was a little bit bed and breakfast kind of thing, and so we trooped off in a borrowed car, my father, my mother, Mrs. Mary Van Hook holding my newborn baby brother, and me. And we get to the farm, we go in, I'm looking at chickens, all excited, and the woman who's at the front desk in the kind of farmhouse where we come in says, oh, I'm terribly sorry, she says, looking at Mrs. Van Hook, and points at her and says, she's not welcome here. She can't come in. I'm sorry, terribly sorry to tell you this. I had never seen it. I had no idea what that was. I didn't know what happened. And I looked at Mrs. Van Hook, and I suddenly realized she knows exactly what's happening. She has seen this before. And it began to strike me as a child. I don't know if it was clear then, but when I talk about the gift of courage that was given, I realized that the courage that the 4 students from A&T and that other black civil rights activists have demonstrated, not just in the 60s, but for decades. The civil rights movement obviously begins in slavery, so it's a long story. But I realized one of the differences between white people and black people is it takes courage to be a black person in the United States. You don't have to have courage to be a white person. And I realized, in some way, looking back, this is one of the ways that the Freedom Rides, and I know a lot of you are interested in questions of memory, but one could say, well, this is warped memory, Paul. This is false memory. But looking back and realizing, I never realized it before, how much courage it took Mrs. Van Hook to be Mrs. Van Hook at that time in history. And I think in certain ways, when I decided to go on the Freedom Ride, it was saying like, Mary Van Hook, I'm doing this for you. I want to make good that situation because those people were shit who said you can't come here. I hated them. How dare they treat you like that? Those are rotten thoughts. Those are ugly thoughts. Those are not the thoughts of a peaceful, nonviolent, civil rights person. But you can feel those thoughts and not necessarily act on them. And I felt those things. And so my mother was also another one. Because she, when that was said, my mother, without skipping a beat, looked at that woman and said, Mrs. Van Hook is a part of our family. If she's not welcome here, this is not a place at which we want to stay. We're leaving. And we left. And now I think about that today, and I think, what if millions of mothers, white mothers, had said that in 1948 to other white people? And I asked my mother, I said, what was that? What happened? Why are we leaving? What's going on? And Mrs. Van Hook was saying, oh, Mrs. Breines, Mr. Breines, just take me back to New York and drop me off and you stay here. That is, she felt she was disturbing and messing up our little vacation. But for my mother, this was something much more important. And I can't believe the courage it took my mother to do that. And she didn't skip a beat. She just said. So I was brought up in certain ways. And I'll mention something else, another example of why I've been wondering, what kind of a white person do I want to be? And my mother gave me a good answer at that time. In a situation where Mrs. Van Hook is confronted with this kind of racism, you stand with her. That's what you do. So when black people are struggling for their rights and they're risking their lives, and I was at that time a college sophomore, I wasn't stuck in high school grooves where I didn't know anything about any of these things, that you go with them. You stand with them. I think, Professor Smallwood, I think you, in the early afternoon session, don't be nervous, I'm not challenging you with anything, but you said something that was very, very interesting for me because it pertains to why I went on the Freedom Rides. You mentioned that you referred to white students somewhere, white people somewhere, looking at a photograph of black people who were lynched, who were dead, and they were laughing at it. Well, when I was in high school, my parents had a pamphlet who was the We Charge Genocide pamphlet? Is he here? Yeah, way in the back of the room. I'm sorry, Tom Porter. I'm sorry, Tom, because Tom has, if any of you want to look at this, you can see it, because Professor Porter has a copy of a pamphlet which was put out by a communist group in the 1940s, and it was called We Charge Genocide. And it's a history of lynching of black people in the United States, and it was submitted to the United Nations to bring charges of genocide, the crime of genocide, against the United States for its history of lynching black people. And on the cover is a history of two young black men hanging from a tree. And beneath them are a group of white people who have just killed these two young men. And the white people are smoking cigarettes and chatting and talking, and there are mothers with babies in their arms, and they seem they're perfectly happy. And I became obsessed with that photograph. Because not only did I not laugh at it, I was horrified by it, but not horrified simply because what had been done to those two young men, but what it meant for me. That is, I then had to ask, where do I fit in that picture? And I realized, this was when I was a sophomore in high school, without understanding what the consequences would be, that if I had to choose between being with those two black men, that is being dead, or being with those white people, I would be with those two black men. I couldn't be with the people who had killed them. I just couldn't do it. I would feel I was betraying my mother. I was betraying Mary Van Hook. And I couldn't talk to this about anybody, with anybody. I didn't talk about this to my high school friends. They would have thought I was a freak. And I would have been called a nigger lover earlier than I got called that, which happened when I went on the Freedom Rides. And I learned, oh, in this racially whacked out society, if you take a stand with black people as a white person, that's the name you get. That's what you get called. And I decided then, in 1961, not in high school, that I was going to try, along with lots of other white people I knew, to be the best N-word lover that I could be. If any of you would like to say anything, please do. Ask me any questions, ask me to clarify something. I haven't talked about being in prison. I haven't talked about what I think about how to be a white person today. There's lots, but I've gone on for a lot of time, and I want to have, there's a question and answer period, but if any of you would like to say anything, or in fact, if anyone would like to stand up and stretch, you could do that too, because you're sitting, and thank you all for coming. I mean, obviously, some of you had to be here, but to be here with the weather as it is, I'm terribly sorry. Yes?
Hi, my name is Victoria Harvey. I'm a political science student in sophomore from and my question is touched on your parents, but how do your parents feel in terms of you being a white person and being a freedom rider?
Thank you very much. Excellent question. Virtually all of the parents of black freedom riders lost their jobs because their children were freedom riders. Mississippi set up an organization, a secret organization called the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission. Is the Freedom Ride book here anywhere? The one that... Oh, yeah. Well, if this is a book, a photograph album about the Freedom Rides, and you can see what I looked like when I was 20 in there. But in the very first image, this is a book with, you see, here's Helen Singleton. These are the mug shots of the Freedom Riders. And this is Helen Singleton 4 years ago. And this is her husband, Robert Singleton, and here, no, this is not, this is Matthew Walker. And it's a before and after shot. There was a young man who's the editor of this book, a photographer named Eric Etheridge, so what I was going to say was, you can see there's a stamp on the first image that's in this book, which is a headline from a Jackson newspaper. And notice the history, notice the word, those of you in the front row can see this. It says 27 mixers jailed on arrival here. Mixers. That was the proper word for N-word lover, a white person who was mixing the races. Imagine the shorthand. Imagine what that assumes. But this is the State Sovereignty Commission took all the mug shots. The State Sovereignty Commission was set up by the state of Mississippi, and its purpose, it was a secret organization that was not known about until it disbanded itself in the 21st century. It was a secret organization whose function was to harass and disrupt the civil rights movement. And that article, you'll see a stamp beneath it where it was on file. It was and it says Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, which is, and the photographs eventually ended up in the Library of Congress, and a photographer who grew up outside of Mississippi and was 6 years old at the time of the Freedom Rides and decided to take these photographs, go around the country and interview, he got a grant to interview freedom riders who were still alive, and there are some of us. Wait, no, I didn't respond yet at all to this question. I haven't even begun, but as you saw in the example of my mother, okay, and my father supported her, I feel blessed because I was brought up to participate in the Freedom Rides. That was the function of my parents being parents. My mother taught me how to do that. The little examples I just gave. So my mother was as naive as I was, and everyone who participated in the freedom rides, as realistic as people were, say, oh, I could be killed. Yes, we're realistic, but we were tremendously naive and idealistic, and there wouldn't have been freedom rides if we hadn't been naive and idealistic. It was required. My mother, there was an article in my hometown newspaper, which was the Scarsdale Enquirer. I spent my high school years in what was then the wealthiest white suburb in the country. And a sociologist who was trying to figure out what happened in the 1960s, in the 1970s wrote an article called, "You've Got to Be from Scarsdale to Know How Bad Things Really Are." Like, isn't it interesting that one of the things that's happening in the 1960s is that rich kids are trying to make revolutions against capitalism? That's odd. How did that happen? So my mother was interviewed because of there was an article in the paper, Scarsdale graduate goes to the freedom rides. He's in jail in Mississippi. So they interview my mother. My mother says, we're very proud of our son. The guy who was my best friend in prison, like me, a Jewish guy from New York, his father was no longer alive. His mother disowned him because he went on the freedom rides. She was that upset that he did that. My parents then got hate mail from highly educated white people in the suburb of Scarsdale, New York. We hope your nigger-loving son rots in prison. I have the letters. And people actually tried to burn a cross on my parents' front lawn. They never said a word to me about any of that because they knew what it would do to me. They took on what it did to them. They never said to me, Paul, don't go, we'll never see you again. And they required, they begged, and they finally convinced Mary Van Hook not to say the same thing because she knew she had lived in the South and she knew what racism was very upfront, and she didn't think she'd ever see me again. But they wouldn't let her say that. And they didn't say that to me. They didn't say, don't go, you're going to break our hearts. And Jim Zwerg, if you've seen the PBS documentary by Stanley Nelson about the freedom rides, Jim Zwerg, here he is as a grown-up down below and in the plaid shirt, and he talks in the big documentary about the freedom riders, and he says he called his parents, he was a student at Fisk, and he became friends with John Lewis and was in the original Freedom Ride group. And he called his parents to say, Mom, Dad, I'm joining the Freedom Rides. And his mother took the phone from his father, and she said, you're killing your father. And he said, Mom, I love you both very much, but I have to go. And which is extraordinary, which is remarkable. I mean, this is the parent. And there were 4 or 5 black freedom riders who didn't tell their parents that they went on the freedom rides because they were underage and they lied about their age. One of them, Matthew Walker, I think, was 16 years old when he was a freedom rider. He's not in this photograph. But so I happened to have the good luck that my parents were very, very supportive. I graduated from Scarsdale High School in 1959, 2 years after the Little Rock 9 of 1957. And by the way, now it's coming, that many of you have seen the photographs. One of the 9 students who integrated Little Rock, Arkansas High School, was a girl named Elizabeth Eckford. I don't know if that's a familiar name, but the photograph of her in sunglasses walking with her books in her arm and these white women chasing behind her, obviously screaming all sorts of racial slurs and insults at her, was another example that photograph was one that everyone in the country saw that. And some people saw that photograph and said, that young woman is extraordinary. That young woman is doing something that other Americans, white and black, are not doing. This young woman is doing everything that in all my civics classes, all my white teachers had said, if you're going to be a citizen of the United States, these are the kind of things you're supposed to do, and she was doing them, whereas most people weren't. And I thought, we were born in the same year, we're the same age. I was a sophomore in high school, she was a sophomore in high school, as Terrence Roberts and the other Little Rock 9. I mean, there's another example of the extraordinary courage And that was in, anyway, there was the current, so 288 students in my graduating class. 2 years after I graduated, 1961, I joined the Freedom Rides. Not one of those 287 students said, hey, Paul, that's really cool what you did. You know, what was it like being in prison? Congratulations, that's a great thing. I wish I had done it. Nobody said anything. None of my classmates said, you know, what are you, crazy? What are you doing? But they didn't, there was nothing. At my 50th high school reunion, everyone said, Paul, I didn't know you were a Freedom Rider. That's fantastic. That's terrific. There was like, and I'd say like, yeah, where were you in 1961? You know, and this is to point out, which is one of the reasons why I had tears when Michael introduced me. I mean, that would reduce anyone to tears, but also just because, and I say that affectionately, Michael, I think that was terrific. And he had no idea what he was going to say when he came here. He made, that was all spontaneous, and it was very loving, and I'm deeply indebted to it, to him and it. But, what was I saying? Yeah, the 50th reunion, they were all very nice about it, and that's partly, that, and that gets into all the questions of what does it mean? That is, it isn't as if all those people who now, my white classmates who said, hey, congratulations, Paul, I didn't know you're a Freedom Rider, that's really terrific, that they are now, that they have been thinking for the last 40 years, what kind of a white person do I want to be? That's not the question they've mostly been asking. Hopefully some are. But yes, other questions. Is that okay? Was that responsive to what? Yes, great.
Me?
Yes, of course.
So I've read like 3 novels and 3 history books on Parchman Prison. I can't remember what it is that I read. It's an infamous prison, is it not?
At the 50th reunion of the Freedom Riders, there's a big sign at Parchman Prison, which is now closed, and it says, welcome back, Freedom Riders. But it wasn't meant as a joke. It was just like, you know, very friendly. No, but go ahead. Sorry.
I mean, did you, when you got, do you remember what my recollection is that it was a famous prison labor-oriented prison. It was important even to the early years of Jim Crow, because an awful lot of Jim Crow prison labor came out of it.
Yes.
So I was wondering if, in addition to sharing some of your experiences in prison, if you actually studied the place that you were.
I didn't study it as in-depth as you obviously have, but what you're saying is absolutely correct. If any of you, I don't know, do any of you listen to old, like Mississippi Delta blues from the 30s and 40s? Another Man Done Gone from Parchman Farm. He had a long chain on. I mean, Parchman Farm is legendary, as you said, and it's in a lot of blues songs, and it's all, Another Man Done Gone from Parchman Farm, he had a long chain on. That is, Parchman Farm was a site of chain gangs. And it was a huge farm. And it was Senator James Eastland, who was one of the main racist, plantation-owning, segregationist senators, to whom the Kennedy administration was completely beholden for votes. They profited from this farm. It sold vegetables, lots of vegetables all over the state and out of state too. And they made a lot of money, and they had unpaid labor. It was prison labor, white and black. And the prison laborers worked in chain gangs. So now you say like, oh my God, you were in Parchman Farm. Yes, I was in Parchman Penitentiary, which was referred to affectionately as Parchman Farm, but I was put with all the other white male Freedom Riders into a big rectangular room called the First Offenders Unit. And it had like 50 little bunk beds, and we had we had unusual prison outfits, which were olive green Army surplus boxer shorts, which were peculiar because you couldn't close the fly. There was like an elliptical opening, so part of your stuff was kind of visible, and it was, but now you think like, oh, okay, now we're getting into gay stuff here? No, we're not, But I can tell you that when I was in prison in 1961, I had never heard the word gay. And almost no straight people had. It was a term only gay people used because, and it's hard to imagine, because gay people weren't out, as we now call it, in 1961. That didn't happen till later. So nobody knew that there were gay freedom riders until like 30 or 40 years later. So we were in a first offenders dormitory unit. It was like, and there were these bunk beds. We had these funny little uniforms, and the guards absolutely hated us because they were white and we were traitors to the race. We had shown a kind of loyalty to humanity instead of to white privilege or white power and stuff. The Vietnam War produced an awareness of what we call post-traumatic stress syndrome. And as a lot of you know, and particularly those of you who study memory know, that post-traumatic syndrome, simply put, is the incapacity to forget something hideous and horrible. You can't forget it, so it haunts you. It wakes you up at night. It makes you think that this terrible thing is actually happening when you're dreaming it, and you hit the person who you're sleeping next to because you think they're an enemy or something like that. Particularly in the 1963-64 voter registration work, the Freedom Summer, in which when James Chaney and Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman were killed by racist thugs in a car, what was I saying? People who worked, thank you, Greg, who worked in that part of the civil rights movement, many of them ended up with what was called post-traumatic syndrome, but there wasn't a word for it then. That is, these were people who were risking their lives 24 hours a day to go out into rural areas to register black people to vote. Some of them were white people, some of them were black people. They were SNCC field secretaries. They were always under the gun, and then 3 of them were actually killed. So some of the freedom riders, James Foreman was one, many, many years later, suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress syndrome. I and all of us who were in the first offenders unit, and I think many other freedom riders, except obviously Jim Zwerg, probably has some memories of this happening to him, and that could be pretty painful. I remember the tomatoes that were served at lunch and dinner from the farm. They were fresh, they were delicious, they were unbelievably tasty. And my memory said to me, forget that you were afraid 24 hours a day. You didn't know what was going to happen. You didn't know what the guards would do. They obviously were not going to kill you, but it was always nervous and always tense, and I don't remember that. I remember that I must have been afraid 24 hours a day because I vaguely remember, but it's not in my stomach. What's in my stomach is the taste of those tomatoes. And I met 2 other freedom riders, and one of them was at a publication party for this book. We're in New York at a very fancy kind of art gallery, and there's wine and cheese, and everyone's fantastic, and people are saying, oh, two men my age came over, and one of them took me aside and said, you know, I have to tell you, I always wanted to join the Freedom Rise, and I didn't have the courage to do it. I don't know how you did it. I have so much respect for you. It's so amazing you did it. I was feeling awful for him. And I said, oh, God, you know, I'm sorry, you know, it's okay. Your heart was in the right, that's terrific. Your heart was in the right place. And my friend Lou, who threw up with me when we left prison, he comes over and he says, Paul, listen, do you remember the tomatoes? So here are these people looking at us admiringly, these heroes, and they're talking about tomatoes. And he said, do you remember the tomatoes? And I said, oh my God, Lou, do I remember the tomatoes? Are you kidding? I can only, you know, I realized this, it's funny, but then I realized when you only have 3 meals a day, and you can't, you know, and you have some tomatoes that are really good, like they're very precious. Food, pencils, we got pencils twice a week to write letters home, which were censored, we learned afterwards. If you wrote a letter home and said, Mom, Dad, I'm freaking out, get me the hell out of here, that letter would get there like special delivery. If you wrote and said, I remain strong, the struggle continues, we're all good, and we're in good spirits, and when we get out, we're going to keep the battle against racism going, all that stuff would be blacked out. I mean, they went to that degree. A priest and a minister and a rabbi, the courage that they showed, came to visit Freedom Riders, and Rabbi Perry Nussbaum, who came and visited the Freedom Riders and sent little letters home saying, it was a form letter, said, I visited your son or your daughter, he's fine, et cetera, et cetera. His synagogue was firebombed. People knew, the racists knew he was doing this. He was risking his life to do his ministry, as was the priest and the minister. So some of the people, I'm not a checker player or a chess player. That's another way I may disappoint you. But you got a pencil twice a week, and people drew checkerboards on the cement floors of the dormitory, the unit, and took the bread that was given to us at lunch. At breakfast, there were biscuits. Nobody would sacrifice them. But the white bread, you take the whites and you make a little white checker piece, and then you take the brown of the bread and you mold a little brown checker piece, and you can play checkers. And one guy even made a chess set out of bread. So it's it turns out, none of us knew this at the time because the guy, Byron Bear, who died 2 years ago, couldn't tell this. He was a little bit older. He was in his 30s. He was an engineer. And he brought a grape-sized transmitter radio, a one-channel radio, into prison in his rectum. Now, let me just mention, the women Freedom Riders, and I didn't know this until 50 years later, the women Freedom Riders, white and black, were all told that when they were incarcerated, they would have vaginal searches, which was just something, no one was thinking that somebody's going to bring in a transistor radio in their genitals. A woman is not likely to do that. This was just to intimidate people. And it was also to highlight, it was symbolic. It had to do with white fears and fantasies, these vaginal exams, I think. That is, think for a minute about, all the women Freedom Riders, white women Freedom Riders, when they were incarcerated, when they were interrogated by the police, they said, you're down here to have sex with black men, aren't you? That's why you're here. Well, you're going to, And one of the things is, you have these vaginal exams. It's a kind of symbolic rape. You just say, you come down here and you want to have sex with black men, this is what we're going to do to you. But he actually brought this radio in his butt. But here's an interesting twist to it. None of us knew this because he couldn't tell anybody that he had this radio, which he listened to once a day, because he didn't know whether one of us was an agent or a spy or working for the man. So none of us knew this, but there was one episode where they told us, the guards pulled us aside and said, we just heard on the radio Martin Luther King's been killed. It was 1961. He's dead. What do you think of that, kids? You're a great leader? Gone. And people say, so we said, they're just, obviously this is just not, they're putting us on. This is torment. This is what they do when they increase the sugar in our diet so that we'll have sugar highs and do things that are bad, and then they'll take our mattresses away. I can't say this parenthetically, I can't tell you how frustrating this was for these poor guards. Here's what's happened. As you know, the United States, someone's giving a talk tomorrow in Michael Roberto's class on the Cold War. This was in the height of the Cold War. The United States was broadcasting itself to the world as the great democratic, freedom-loving alternative to Russian communist totalitarianism. You say, freedom? Democracy? Excuse me, look what's happening in Jackson. Look what's happening in Nashville. Look what's happening in Greensboro. This is not freedom. This is not democracy. This was in the midst of the Cold War, at a time of extensive continent-wide African liberation movements from colonialism. So there was a lot of pressure on the United States government to make sure that you didn't have a situation in Jackson, Mississippi with the Freedom Riders where large numbers of black, but even worse, significant numbers of white people were killed. That would not be good. So when I was in prison, the many people who were in prison in July and August and September and into October of 1961 were, in certain respects, we were protected criminals, because the authorities were, the guards wanted to kill us or to cut us up, but they were, that's why it was so frustrating to them. They couldn't, because there was too much attention being paid at that point to the Freedom Riders, as unpopular as we were in the United States. Freedom Rides were despised, not just by my classmates, but by most of the country, and by the leadership of the NAACP, the leadership of the Urban League. What, these bunch of, who are these crazy, what are they doing? And this was also competition. What happens to us long-standing civil rights leadership groups in the face of these young upstarts? So there was a lot of pressures and things working against our being messed up. Okay, yeah, so are there any other questions? Is the time up? Do people, yes? Are there equivalents to Freedom Riders today? Well, I don't know a lot about it, but I mean, I think coming out of the same spirit is this Moral Monday movement that's afoot. And in certain respects, you know, it's a very different situation. And there are, I happen to be a bisexual person, so I'm interested in issues of sexuality. But I don't think that you can simply, as many people tend to do, is to make hoping to be sympathetic, but it's not, to say homophobia and racism are pretty similar. They're not necessarily, and there's certainly no ways to say like, well, black people and gay people. What? Black people, I mean, there's not a way to mix this, but I think that the courage that Mrs. Van Hook and the courage that I and all the other Freedom Riders were able to muster, I mean, that's the courage that it takes a gay person to come out to their parents, to themselves, to some. So that wasn't a ride, it wasn't collective, it was all lots of little individuals doing this. But anybody else think of other examples? I mean, I should tell you, just quickly to tell you, you would say like, well, so what are you doing today, Paul? What about you? Why don't you make a freedom ride? I live in the midst of political despair, personally. So what I did was, in my neighborhood, which is about 85% people of African descent. Some of them are African Americans, some of them are from Ghana, from Sierra Leone, from Eritrea, from Afro-Cubans live in the neighborhood, and about 15% white people. And the neighborhood is full of litter. I said, oh, wait a minute, the black people litter? No, if you go 1 block away from where I live to Mass Avenue, where only white people live, and the neighborhood I live in has a large black population, you'll find lots of litter and trash too, because everybody is littering these days. And the only difference is that in my neighborhood, you find empty packs of Newport menthol, and on Mass Ave, you find empty packs of Marlboro filters. Right? There's the white cigarettes. It's like a kind of strange thing. Why am I mentioning this? To honor my mother, I decided when I moved into this neighborhood, because there was so much trash, that I was going to pick up trash. So I go out 2 or 3 times a day with gloves and plastic bag, and I pick up trash, and I throw it in the trash bin, and it also enables me to meet lots of people and to talk to them and to find out things and to make, so I thought, I don't know how to change the world anymore. but at least I can keep the neighborhood clean. And a friend of mine came with me for a trash run, as I call them. And 3 weeks later, I got in the mail a very nice heavyweight hoodie that says on it, "White trash collector." And I showed it to a gay guy in my building, and he said, "Honey, I've been collecting white trash for decades." So there's a lot of different reads on this. Now here's an interesting thing. This is a very sophisticated audience, because when any white person in my neighborhood and my building to whom I mention this, and I have not worn the sweatshirt outside, I wear it in my house, but I don't wear it out, every white person in my building and in my neighborhood who I told this story to, you know what they said? They didn't laugh the way most of you did. They said, they looked very depressed. They said, "Why do you have to play the race card?" And I thought, I didn't say anything, and I thought, are you serious? Do you not understand that we live in a race card? The whole culture is a race card. It's not something you can play or not play. It's here. It's around us. Every white person and every black person to whom I told this story, even my friend Kofi from Ghana, who is not a white trash collector, he didn't really know what white trash meant. Very smart guy, but it's not his framework. Every black person I mentioned this to cracked up. They just thought this was the funniest thing in the world, and you should wear it on the street. Oh, God, yes, wear it on the street. Sure, why not? I still haven't. And one black homeless Vietnam veteran in a drunken stupor said something that I'll stop with. He said, "Oh, no, don't wear that sweatshirt. Look, you have a good reputation among your people. White trash respect you. If you wear that sweatshirt, you're dissing your own people. So don't wear it." So this then obviously raises the question of stereotypes, but thank you so much for coming. And also, let me say, let me just also say, because then you'll clap even more, which is that I found the discussions today and the discussions last night after that wonderful talk by Will Jones, the discussions today were I missed the last one. I went home to take a nap because Roberto kept me up till 4 in the morning or something. And so I had to be ready for this and have my nails done and stuff. But today was just terrific. This conference has been, not because of my participation, obviously, but the students, you've all been great. I mean, the discussion around the legacy of Franklin McCain, what a tribute, what a fine gesture that has been. So thank you so much again for coming. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.